But disinformation is basically where you're deliberately putting out wrong information. Misinformation is just wrong, basically. Fifth Avenue in 1903 and Fifth Avenue in 1913. And lo and behold, it's all horses in 1903 and it's all motor cars, automobiles in 1913. In the 10 years on Fifth Avenue, that is what's happened. Gender diversity particularly, but also general diversity across the board in the development of tech is otherwise you're creating bias in the system.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving up your valuable Thursday evening. I'm sure you probably want to be looking at the audience, be at home playing your Xbox or out on your e-scooter or whatever it was. So thank you very much for coming this evening. Let me introduce myself. I'm Syed Kamall. I'm a professor of politics and international relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham. I'm also part-time here as the director of academic research, building out academic networks with academics at current universities who want to come in and speak. I organise monthly food for thought lunches and other events, and we try and get students, university academics, school students in, because we are an educational charity. Now, after all that, I'm delighted to introduce you to tonight's guest speaker. Lord Tim Clement-Jones is a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords and has previously served as a party spokesman on matters of health, DCMS as well as digital, and now DCIT, which is Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. His political work is centred around the issues of culture, media, intellectual property and digital policy, and some aspects of health, such as health data and cancer services. He has been the chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence and was instrumental in legislative discussions on AI and technology. His work extends to advocacy for ethical governance and the responsible use of AI. After all that, Tim, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us at the IAA this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Syed. Phew, yeah. And I'm still only 35.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a pretty good representation.
Yeah, clearly you must have used ChatGPT to ask how old you are, and it comes up with the answer, you're 35. So let's start with you, so people understand you as the author and how you approached writing this book. Tell us first of all about your own political or ideological philosophy. I note that you quote J.S. Mill on the harm principle in the book, so we understand philosophically where you're coming from when you look at AI.
Yes, I think it's this sort of interesting mixture, really, of social and economic liberal. I'm a big Ralph Dahrendorf fan, and I suppose, in a sense, he is the difference between the purely economic liberal and the very much the freedom of expression, the J.S. Mill liberal, and if you like, the liberal who is moving more into, it's not quite social democracy, but certainly life chances is all about social mobility. It's providing the opportunities. So I am, put it this way, a regulator to the extent that I believe that there are certain things you need to do to underpin people's opportunities. That may be the way that you run universities, may be the way you run education, but I think that is a really important aspect. So I'm not a free market liberal to that extent, and I know I sit in a shrine here, but...
and all these people have come to pay homage.
To homage to the great Arthur Selden. But that is really where I come in. So I do think that you have to, of course, liberty is very, very important, but community and opportunity are extremely important that go with that as well.
And now tell us about your encounter or relationship with AI. How did you get interested in it? Where did it start? How's it developed, and what motivated you to write the book?
Well, it came from the creative industries, really, because in the sort of mid-2000s, sort of 2004, 2005, we had this streaming service called Napster, and they were illegally, as it happened, and all the law cases, sued the hell out of them, but they basically took music and turned it into digital streaming and they didn't pay their progenitors. But it struck me that the digital world was really arriving. It was no longer about DVDs, certainly wasn't about vinyl, and so we were moving into the digital age. And I sort of appointed myself digital spokesperson because I didn't see anybody on my front bench who was doing anything to do with digital. And so that led on later, after the coalition in 2016, to me thinking, well, look, we still don't have really a handle on what artificial intelligence is all about. And that was in the foothills, really. We had predictive AI. We had the beginnings of, books. I had roadmaps and various things from various organizations, but mainly happening in Silicon Valley. And I thought, well, we got to understand this stuff. And you form an all-party group in order to try and inform your colleagues, in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords. And you create a community as well outside of people who want to come in and talk about it. And so that was the first step in 2016 with Stephen Metcalfe, who was then the chair of the Science and Technology Committee. And we met at a breakfast one day and we thought, yeah, we've got to do this. And then as a result of forming that, they thought, well, it's a bit like the blind leading the blind. The House of Lords Liaison Committee thought, well, who the hell do we get to chair this new bright, shiny AI select committee that we've just set up to look into the opportunities and risks of AI? Yes, he's just set up an all-party group. So they asked me to chair it. And that was quite transformative. And really, ever since then, I've done nothing really but, eat, live and breathe AI.
Yeah, we see that in the House of Lords. I want to cover a couple of things you said there. The first one is about regulation. Clearly, you're in the IA. Lots of people, lots of classical liberals are probably sceptical of regulation or want minimalist regulation. Of course, there might well be some anarcho-capitalists who want no regulation. Now, I'm also a classical liberal, but I often say to my libertarian and classical liberal friends that I would prefer there to be no regulation, but there has to be something to stop things going wrong, or when something goes wrong, people expect politicians to have an answer, whether you like it or not. Therefore, tell us about, given where you're coming from, how do you see the sort of the regulatory landscape for AI, either from traditional regulation to technology and AI, and what sort of regulatory landscape would you like to see, one in this country, but also on an international level?
Well, I think it starts with the fact that AI is a very special technology in a sense. I know people say, how do you define AI and all that? But basically, it's, algorithms. It's particular forms of algorithm, which may or may not be sophisticated.
On that, do some people think we should not call it artificial intelligence? Because it's not intelligent. They think it's like machine learning. Do you get involved in that sort of semantic debate or not?
Sadly, it was called artificial intelligence in 1956 by John McCarthy, and we're stuck with it. And I'm afraid it is slightly misleading. But the fact is, if you ask GPT-4 a question now, it seemed pretty intelligent when it crunches a 100-page document and gives you a 3-page summary and tells you, the various points of weakness in the argument as you go through it. I mean, it has the appearance of intelligence, and it probably now passes the Turing test in many, many ways, which is whether or not you can distinguish between it and the response of a human. So actually, I think we're getting nearer to that definition, the use of those words, artificial intelligence, being correct in those circumstances. But because it has this ability to be autonomous, it is a relative black box. I mean, these networks that inside, the algorithm inside, sometimes you don't know quite how they weight the factors by which it takes its decision. Quite often you don't. You don't know what material it's ingested quite often in order to come up with the answers that it does. It's fine if it's a closed system where you're giving it a document to crunch. But for instance, if you ask it a search question, quite often we've seen quite a lot of hallucinations there. And so there are risks associated with it.
Perhaps should explain hallucinations for those who don't know. In the context of AI, it means basically it's effectively made up an answer, but it's made up the answer based on the data it had. It's incorrect.
And as you know, Syed, the whole question of data bias is a real issue. So you might be inserting data into a system which is historic. You're trying to, say, for instance, you're using a recruitment tool, an AI recruitment tool, and they're going on, well, who were the successful people who got in last time? Well, you may find it incredibly biased against a cohort of people that you really do want to take on board, but you haven't historically taken on board. So it's as basic as that. And so there's a risk there in terms of the way that AI operates. There's the autonomy by which it operates, where, it may take decisions on its own without proper oversight. And so you need a risk assessment process. What is that but regulation? You need standards. You need ethical principles inserted into those standards. And that, again, is regulation. So you need some level of regulation. Now, how heavy or how light, that's where a lot of the debate, in my view, lies. We can argue endlessly about whether, the AI Act in Europe is the right way of doing it. It's pretty heavy duty, but they think the Brussels effect is going to mean it's like the GDPR, that everybody, is going to have to conform. We have a rather different approach, which I think is too soft. The States, strangely enough, Congress has put forward, some 80 bills on AI. And some of them are going to go through on a bipartisan basis. So we may become an outlier. But at the end of the day, in my view, what you have to have is interoperability internationally. And that's where I think, in a sense, the regulators and non-regulators, maybe more of the colleagues here, would come together, where standards are where it's at. So you have principles at the top, which we can all agree on, the OECD principles about accountability, about freedom from bias, and so on. Transparency, very important about AI. So we agree on the principles. We may not agree on that middle level of how much legislation or regulation, but then we agree on what kind of standards we need in terms of risk assessment, testing, training, and so on at that level. It's all about how much you mandate that. I think at the end of the day, you need some mandation. But you don't need to do very much, provided the incentives are there for the big AI systems developers to adopt it. But you can't have something that's purely voluntary.
And how do you get international coordination on this? We've got the EU, and we talked about the Brussels effect. You've got the US doing more than they originally started doing. You've got the UK that's trying to be a bit more flexible. And when I sit on the Digital Communications Committee of the House of Lords, and when we were doing our inquiry on large language models, we had some witnesses who said, we like the fact that you're not being as prescriptive as the EU, but you're also not being, you're being a little bit, you're being a little bit more flexible as well compared to the US. Given this is going to be global, you've got China, for example. How much do we engage with China on these standards? China was invited to the AI safety summit, as it were, because I think Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister, said you can't ignore them. So I just wonder, how do you see global standard or global cooperation emerging?
Yes. Well, by the way, and I'm not blowing smoke, but your committee, the Communications and Digital Committee, has done some very good work, because, one of my real worries is about intellectual property and AI, the ingestion by AI of intellectual property without paying for it, and then the output being passed off as human creation. So I do think that's a big deal at the end of the day. But as far as China's concerned, I don't often praise government ministers, as you know, apart from in your case, of course.
That's a long time ago.
Dowden did exactly the right thing. We have to be pragmatic about it. We can't just simply say we can't have China coming to our Bletchley Park AI safety summit. They are part of the question that we need to answer. And, one of the things that surprised me a bit, even though I thought I'd tracked China pretty carefully, I've been there 40 times over the last 20 years, is how much regulation there is in China on AI, and generative AI in particular. So, they are very heavy on this. Now, you may be cynical about this and say, well, it's partly because they don't want any competitor or anything that actually is in a sense more intelligent and able to deal with things than the state itself. So it's like they want to avoid that. But They've accepted the Beijing principles, which are very closely based on the OECD ethical principles. They've put in a lot of regulation on generative AI in terms of risk assessment and standards and so on. So I think Oliver did exactly the right thing by inviting them. Now, of course, I'm not saying that all is rosy in the garden. I think we have to be very alert. And I think there are other state actors, Russia, North Korea and so on, Iran, who are not as come hither as China, strangely enough. But they have the ability to, do quite a lot of bad things. So, how much we manage to corral everybody into an international standards, international set of standards, I think is not completely clear at the moment. Not any time soon, I would say. But I don't think for this purpose, China is a very big outlier.
Let me give you a scenario. You talked about the moment when they were looking for someone who understood something about AI to lead a select committee. We've got a general election that's just been called. Most people think they know what the result's going to be. But what if we had a surprising result where, for example, Labour didn't get an overall majority, and they came to some agreement with the Lib Dems, and they said, we need someone to, we must do something on AI. Who can we find who does know something about AI? Here you are, Lord Clement-Jones. Let's ask him. Tim, would you be the Minister for AI? And you accept, I'm making that assumption, you can disabuse me of that. What would you do day one?
Well, first of all, I'd say you've got to pay me. There are a lot of unpaid ministers in the Lords, and so I wouldn't be going there. I'd say, A, you've got to pay me. B, what I want to do is put a bill in place that mandates certain AI standards, and I would pick some very clear standards of the kind that I've already mentioned: testing, training, risk assessment, and so on. And I would make sure that those were mandated, and then you would have to try and work through what the consequences of failure to adhere to those standards. You probably have to have some scaling, so you'd be talking about the major AI systems. But this is, I think, strangely enough, what's going to be in the King's speech this time around. So they probably won't call on me. The sad thing is that there are probably certain people on the Labour front bench in the Commons who actually think they know about this stuff. I know Peter Kyle, for instance, has been to the States. He's had a lot of conversations with Congress too, with the Democrat Party. So I think that they're not going to call upon my services, but I am looking forward to at least a level of legislation that we need, because you can't just simply rely on people talking about responsible AI or voluntary agreements between all the big tech developers and so on. Right the way through, from the tech developers to the adopters to procurement principles and so on. I think we're going to have, a bit more kind of coherence about the whole thing. And I don't think it's rocket science. There are freedom of speech issues to do with algorithms and misinformation, disinformation, and so on. And in a way, this comes back a little bit to what happens during the election as opposed to after the election. But I think when it comes to actually legislating, it is not going to be nearly as difficult as the online safety bill. We talked about freedom of expression, freedom of speech rightly throughout that. And that was really, a real conundrum. And we had to drop parts of the bill in response to people's concerns. And we may come back to that when it comes to disinformation, misinformation, if the election proves that we've got deepfakes and all that kind of thing happening during the course of the next 6 weeks.
Let me ask you about that. Can you tell the audience or define misinformation, disinformation? What's the difference between the two?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. But disinformation is basically where you're deliberately putting out wrong information. Misinformation is just wrong, basically. Where, for instance, you're putting out facts that aren't correct. So, but disinformation, for my money, is where you're deliberately, like, there's a sort of COVID type messages saying it's going to kill you, or this sort of vaccine damage type information, where it's deliberately done in order to create fear and confusion. And distinguishing between the two is really difficult. And, that's why I was on the joint committee on the draft online safety bill. And, we shied away from doing very much about that, apart from setting up a committee. What's better than setting up a committee to look at it? So the committee hasn't taken shape yet, but, we basically pushed it out to the future.
It reminds me of Jeremy Paxman quote in his book where he said, if you want to kick an issue into long grass, you set up a royal commission.
Exactly. This was not quite as long grass, it was short grass,
We've had some debates in the Lords around the disinformation unit of the government, as it were, which they set up. And I think in one debate we asked, what's the difference between disinformation and difference of opinion? And as we know, think about the referendum, for example, both sides were accusing each other of disinformation, misinformation, and some of that was subjective, some of it was objective. We have these fact checkers. Some people are now asking who fact checks the fact checkers, as it were. How do we, and then also in your book you talk about, if we want to slow down misinformation or disinformation, we have to design it with friction mitigation.
Yes.
Now, friction mitigation sounds slightly Orwellian to me. I just want you to give you a chance to explain that, but also how do you make sure, how can you be objective when people can see the same set of facts but have quite different opinions about them?
Well, for instance, what I wouldn't do is ban political advertising. You just can't do that. I mean, frankly, I think using Facebook and other social media during election is an important part of it. But there are two things you can do. First of all, you can imprint all the message. You need to know where the political messages are coming from. Now, the government shied away from that. They only said political parties need to do that. But that should be on every message. It should be obvious who the sender is. And then if it's a political message and it's to do with the election, then you should be able to, as a social media operation, you should be able to mitigate the way that is sent, i.e. add friction. And it means you just can't just simply, say, right, send repost to thousands and thousands of people. There should be interim ways of dealing with that. Now, don't ask me how Facebook could deal with that, but my friend Richard Allen, who's ex-Facebook, he knows exactly what you need to do in those circumstances. And a lot of quite tech people that I deal with know that it's possible. The slowing down of that amplification of political messaging. Now, it seems to me you're giving pause, and therefore you're not basically sending out what is potentially disinformation. I mean, it could be accurate, but it's just the political messaging is slowed down in the way that it operates. The old story about, what is it? Truth is flown away before untruth has flown away before truth has even got its boots on. I mean, that is really what we're trying to do in the digital world.
We see this sometimes in political tweets when the original accusation has far more retweets than the apology, as it were. So people still believe the original story. Now, in the book, you cover a number of issues, and we're not going to go into them all, otherwise the audience wouldn't get any time to ask questions. So I want to talk about a few of them, and then hopefully some of them will come out from the audience. The first one is clearly one of the concerns is jobs. AI, what's it going to do with jobs? Basic level accountant jobs, basic level legal jobs, for example. Recruitment, it does a lot of recruitment now, a lot of these websites. Now, is AI different, or we've always had this fear of technology, but things have changed? We may have less coal miners in this country, but we've got more people working in the mobile phone industry, or more tech people, for example. Is AI different in the way it destroys jobs? Is it going to create as many jobs or more jobs that it destroys? Should we be worried?
I have a great friend, David Putnam, who you'll know as well, and he always puts up as his first slide Fifth Avenue in 1903 and Fifth Avenue in 1913. And lo and behold, it's all horses in 1903 and it's all motor cars, automobiles in 1913. In the 10 years, on Fifth Avenue, that is what's happened. So, no, I'm not afraid by that, but it takes time to adjust. I do think that actually AI, provided we've got this kind of ethical regulation in place, particularly things like the workplace and bias and so all the things we've talked about, I think will be beneficial, and I think will assist our productivity. But we'll all, have to come up with different forms of job. I mean, new technology creates that. But time is needed, and therefore I think in the short term there are going to be issues of jobs being automated and so on. But the other aspect is that employers need to think, well, what am I doing with this new technology? Am I substituting for people's jobs, or am I augmenting their jobs? Am I making them more satisfactory? Am I, making them, in a sense, better jobs? That's what I would really love employers to be focusing on, because, frankly, already I use AI to a greater degree. It's saving me a great deal of time when I have to crunch papers.
Does it write your speeches for you?
Of course, every speech I've ever made now is all AI,
Then do you give it credit?
The big problem is when you ask AI to make a speech for you, it turns out the most pompous stuff, because it thinks it's in the House of Lords, which is dreadful.
Does it quote Shakespeare?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really is, ladies and gentlemen, it's got a kind of style which, it doesn't work. But basically using it for our purposes, which are, research and background and so on, I mean, it's highly valuable. And you rightly said the legal profession is now absolutely heavily into this, but it's had a reverse effect. What it means is that people like paralegals now, with access to, if you like, legal AI tools, are being as productive and expert as qualified lawyers. So there are implications about these things where, you don't have to be a qualified lawyer to actually deliver a similar level of service to somebody who's qualified. Well, that's important.
One of the things you do talk about, continuing that theme of lawyers, is legal accountability. Obviously, the example that most people quote is the idea of a self-driving car, and if it hits someone, and all the different factors around it. I know you say, let's not go there in the book, but actually I'd like to ask you tonight, let's go there. Just explain and lay out, given that you're a lawyer, all the sort of legal possibilities around that issue of if a self-driving car hits a passenger.
Well, it's really interesting because what we've alighted on in our legislation is it's the insurer now who's going to be liable. Now, it seems to me that I'm not wholly convinced by that, actually. Yeah. I mean, if you're a punter and you bought a car, it seems to me that once you've got a, grade 4 or 5 or whatever it is, and I think we're going to be allowing cars that get to level 4 on the roads very soon.
Do you want to explain those levels? For the
Yes. Well, the levels are degrees of autonomy, and the degree of autonomy that is just shortly going to be allowed on certain roads is a delivery vehicle, for instance, that doesn't require you to be advertent as the driver. So it's actually so confident in the technology that it's going to drive around, and that's the level 4. Now, apparently the people who are going to be responsible are either the manufacturer, but normally it's going to be the insurer, not the owner. So, and I'm not really quite sure about this. I haven't. You've got to kind of ration yourself in a way in politics. And the one thing I haven't got really involved in is all the autonomous vehicle legislation. But all I can say is if I was asked to invest in the insurance industry currently, I don't think I'd be putting too much money in.
So we see a run on shares in insurance industry. It came down to this talk tonight, is it? One of the phrases that we hear quite a lot of is digital literacy. And we hear that quite a lot in all our technology bills. Can you tell the audience what you mean by digital literacy and how you encourage more people to become digitally literate?
Yes.
And why it's important?
Yes, and it's a very different thing from, if you like, what people describe as kind of AI skills, digital skills, and so on. It's the daily understanding of how technology is impacting on us. And I don't think there's nearly enough focus on that in our schools. I think we just expect students when they go to university to be digitally literate, understand how the technology they use works. But it's about how, who's collecting our data? I mean, the Shoshana Zuboff book, Surveillance Capitalism, is an absolute illustration of what is happening to our data. Our data is being absorbed and used, and we are, in a sense, as described by authors like her, as the product. They are using our data to sell back to us. And I think this is the fear that those who understand this stuff have. And unless we begin to understand it to a much greater degree, and again, it's back to the level of trust, because the more you know about this, the more demands you make on those who produce AI systems using data. So this is about, in a sense, it's kind of wanting people to wake up to understand that, what is the smartphone doing? Have you seen all the campaign about not wanting young people to have access to any smartphones before 16? I don't agree with that, because I think otherwise you get a cliff edge where at 16 you suddenly find, oh, whoopee, I've got a smartphone, and you've no idea the impact of it. I think it's all about young people understanding, the impact of screen time and data capture and all that kind of thing. And I'm afraid we don't really have an adequate national strategy to do that. But the more we move into AI really dominating our lives, which it will, the more important that's going to be.
My Fitbit tells us about 6:40. We are going to continue till about 7:10 because we started late to give time for questions. So let me just end my bit of questioning before I open to the audience. I may come back in on the issue of diversity. You talk about, for example, gender diversity in the field of AI. I remember I studied electronic engineering for my first degree long time ago, late 80s, and there were about 3 or 4 young ladies on my course. My son finished his mechanical engineering degree about 2 years ago, and he told me there were only about 3 or 4 young ladies on his course. We've had governments of all political colours. We've had coalition government as well as Labour and Conservative governments, but they've been pretty useless at tackling this issue. Do we put too much reliance on government? And do you think companies should be going far deeper into the education system? First of all, to fill this skills gap that they're supposed to be. When I studied engineering, I was told there was a massive shortage of engineers. We're still being told the same thing 40 years later, as it were. And we've relied on government each time as a solution. Do you have a solution for this? Or should we be encouraging companies to go deep into the education system, such as the technical colleges, etc.?
Yeah, it's a real issue, actually, because, and probably you've seen that in a sense I cop out slightly. I say, all these fantastic organizations, Women in Science and Engineering and, other organizations, they've been bashing away for years trying to get more women in. I mean, it is particularly a gender issue, actually. And one of the reasons for wanting a much greater diversity, of gender diversity particularly, but also general diversity across the board in the development of tech is otherwise you're creating bias in the system, because if you're not part of a community, you don't understand necessarily the impact of those biases or the presence of those biases. So that's really important. And gender bias is one of the, if you're excluding 50% of the population in an AI system, or you're biasing against 50% of the population, you're in deep trouble, basically. But all I could say is I do think there's a role for government, but I think there's also a role for role models. And I'm afraid we're in the awful situation like we were in politics, not so very long ago. I mean, it doesn't take a very long life to remember that we had very few members of the House of Commons who were female. Sure. So, but that has changed hugely over a period of time, and it is possible to change it. But we need those role models, basically. And I don't, see enough of that happening out there. And there are role models in AI investment, AI development, engineering, science, research, and so on. And I think we need to crank that up. But I think government does have a role.
We spoke about regulation, and I think we'll come back to that now, which is, in the book, you talk about ex-ante regulation. We have regulation up front. Some people are concerned that might stop innovation, stop creativity. How do you address that? The second one is, there's still a theory that we're always one click away from competition. You think of IBM, they dominated, people were worried about them. Microsoft then came to dominate, people were worried about them. Okay, they may still be quite dominant in some areas, but we're one click. We don't actually need to be too worried about these big companies. But others say, no, this time it's different because we have network effects. And also these big companies are buying up all the startups. Where are you on this?
Yeah, well, I'm very much on the second limb, I may say. I mean, if you only look at who are the investors, who are the people who got the closest links to the new AI system developers. We've got OpenAI very close to Microsoft. We've got Perplexity, which has got Amazon involved. We've got all these, and Open Anthropic, again with Amazon very closely involved. With all the, if you like, the big tech companies that we're used to, the Amazons and Googles and Microsofts and Metas, they are heavily investing in these AI systems. The partnerships they've got with these big AI systems are extremely close. The Competition and Markets Authority has already started an inquiry into the links between them. But if we're not careful, one of my theses is that, look at cloud. You've got 3 people in the cloud business, 3 huge, and then Microsoft, Amazon, the usual suspects. And if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves throughout our lives, already, you probably, if I ask people to put up their hand, are you a Microsoft person or an Apple person? And you'd probably find it was 50-50 or something like that nowadays. Well, eventually, are we going to become somebody who, for the whole of their life, adheres to a particular AI system, one of them, or are we Coke on the one hand, or are we Pepsi on the other? It's going to be a bit like that without some proper form of competition. And, this is probably where I coalesce with the IEA, actually, because I know they're great fans of lively competition. And I do think that's important. Now, you may say that's a bit forlorn because, the investment in chips, semiconductors, in data sets, in skills are enormous and require great resources, and therefore inevitably you're only going to have a few players. Well, I'd prefer to have 5 or 6 players than just simply over time getting down to 2 or 3. So I think we just have to keep the pot boiling. We have to see proper behavior. After all, let's face it, we failed to ensure that there were any competitors effectively to Google. We failed to ensure any decent competitors to Meta in a certain generation. Of course, TikTok is now, the key social media for a younger generation. So, you get these monopolies in these particular sectors.
It remembers when I was a member of the European Parliament and I used to deal with digital issues and competition issues. I remember Google come to see me and they were lobbying against the power of Microsoft. And I said to Google, Google's public affairs person, be careful what you wish for. People will be lobbying against you one day. So, oh, no, we're a good company. We won't be like that. Look where we are now. It's probably one of the few predictions I got right. So look, we've probably heard enough from me asking questions. We've got about 20 minutes. I'd like to open up to the audience. But in order to manage time efficiently, can I just get an idea of how many people want to ask a question? Could you put your hands up so we can get an idea of whether there's only 3 or 4 or whether there's 10 of you? Okay, well, we can start there. So why don't we start with the lady at the back, and then we'll come forward if it makes sense. Could you introduce yourself, if any affiliation, if you want to admit it, and then direct your question, please?
Yes, hello. My name is Emily. I currently work in the art world, so thank you very much for your talk. And AI has recently come to the forefront of the art world, as well as NFTs, which is partly why I kind of came to your talk, because I was really interested to hear your opinion. And I'm delighted that the creative industries was how you got into AI. So you have spoken a little bit about regulation and what the government could do in future to AI. And I have worked with a couple of artists who are a little bit worried about regulation in a field that is famously unregulated. So do you think that the government should have a position and impose regulations on creativity?
Absolutely not. No, the whole idea is I'm in favour of people, not machines, really. If you ask for my vote, I don't have a vote, nor does he at the general election, but I vote for people. Basically. But the whole idea is what you want to do is try and make sure that AI doesn't eat creative people's lunch, really. And so I want transparency about when AI systems absorb. For instance, there was a fantastic sale in New York in 2018 of a portrait called Edmondo de Bellamy, and it went for nearly $500,000. Extraordinary, because it was a created portrait out of something like 450,000 portraits since medieval times, and it was a really weird mashup. But nevertheless, it was so significant that people paid real money for it. But of course, nobody knew, and it was fine by and large because most of the material wasn't copyrighted. But nowadays, an awful lot of copyrighted material is being absorbed into AI systems without attribution. Now, it's quite interesting. There's been a lot of pushback. There was going to be some sort of text and data mining exception in the UK, but George Freeman, a Conservative minister, bless him, said, no, we're not going to have this. He believed that, copyrighted material shouldn't just be ingested into AI systems without attribution. What we haven't, however, got to is the point where AI systems need to make it transparent what they have taken on board. But you've probably seen recently the FT has had a deal. The Times News Corp has had a deal where they're being paid for their material when it's absorbed into an AI system by OpenAI, for instance. So I think the tide has begun to turn, and I'm a great believer, however, in using AI creatively. So, I helped to do the cover of the book with DALL-E. I put in various ideas, prompts into the system and said, this is the kind of ingredient. And lo and behold, after a few iterations and with a lot of help from my publisher, we got it looking in the right shape. But that was a very creative process. So I'm not against creativity using software. And in fact, we have a specific ability under UK copyright law to use computers and software to create, provided it's got a degree of originality, the right degree of originality, we've got the ability to do that. So I'm very much in favour of protecting artists. I'm very much in favour of them being able to use AI systems, but I think the credit needs to go to the right place, basically.
There's all for music. There's always an analogy here, isn't there? I remember the whole debate about sampling, and you'll remember there's a band called Chic. They did Good Times. Bernard Edwards, amazing bass. I play bass, by the way, and guitar. Amazing bass line, and it was sampled by, I think, the Sugar Hill Gang.
Yeah.
And for years, Chic tried to get some revenue from the money that the Sugar Hill Gang made out of rap. I think it was called Rapper's Delight. And what was very interesting, finally, they did get some revenue, didn't they? And what's interesting now, when Chic perform, they actually add that rap to their performance, which is interesting. But it took a bit of time to get that precedent, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we're still in that world where we haven't yet got absolute government confirmation about what is copying. But I think the world is moving on. The States is rather different. Fair dealing is a very nebulous concept, and I think we're very lucky here with our copyright law. That's all I can say. And that's the one area of standards where I'm worried about the internationalization, because if we're not careful, we're going to water that down, whereas we do have some quite good copyright law in this country. After all, we invented copyright law. Anne's Law, 1714, was the first copyright law in the UK, and I think we still do lead the way, actually.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because a lot of the US companies are saying, we got this, we can scan this data into our system or collect it under fair use. People say, well, hold on a minute, that's copyrighted. You've used my data. And that's a whole debate about how you can traceability. Can those who want to ask questions put their hands up again? Since I've been in the House, I've become very doddery and old and forgetful. So the next two gentlemen at the front, I'll start with you, please. Yeah, sorry, wait for a mic, yes.
Hello, my name is Matthew Feeney. I work at the Center for Policy Studies, and I want to pose a question in the form of a pushback against there being AI principles. What would you say to the argument that saying AI policy is like saying electricity policy? The technology moves far too quickly, and when it affects a wide range of industries affecting healthcare, education, space, the armed forces, that a principle-based approach potentially stifles innovation, and we should actually just have regulators in a position of being technology agnostic, but saying, here are the kind of harms we want you to prevent. Just put the private sector in a technology agnostic position and hopefully let innovation flourish. What's so special about AI, given its already current state of ubiquity?
Well, a lot of people talk about AI as being the new electricity. There's a hell of a lot of regulation around electricity. I mean, how it's carried, the standards, otherwise we'd all get electrocuted on a daily basis. And of course, that's increased over the time, ever since it was introduced. But as for innovation, quite often people say, regulation is the enemy of innovation. But innovation for what? I mean, innovation of itself, if it's beneficial innovation, that's great. But if it's innovation for purposes that we don't want to see, we have to have some control over that, don't we? So that's why you have risk assessment when you're introducing certain new technologies. And if they're high risk, you have to take a view as to what you do about them. So this is just precautionary, really. It's not basically saying that you can't do stuff, but you have to assess whether it's the right thing to do by reference to your principles. And, the OECD principles are not very complicated. It's making sure that somebody's accountable, that it's transparent, that it's free of bias, and a number of other aspects to it. Benefits is generally beneficial to humankind. What I don't want to see is a situation where you have no regulation purely on the basis that people think it stifles innovation. But then, that just gives free rein to somebody who decides to produce something which isn't for our benefit. So I think that's the answer. And that's always been the case for regulation, really. And regulation by itself is not a bad thing, but what you have to make sure, and Syed touched on this, you have to make sure that you're accountable as a regulator. You have to make sure that you're scrutinized as to how you regulate, and you kick the tires as to whether the regulations you put into place are appropriate from time to time. So I think you've got to have safeguards, but I think, and it may be we don't get it right in the first iteration of AI regulation. We certainly won't get it right in the first iteration of online safety regulation, which is very much algorithmic in many ways. But it doesn't mean to say we can't change over time with the appropriate level of oversight.
We've got about 10 minutes left. Just can you raise your hands if you want to ask a question? We've got about 1, 2, 3, 4 people. Can I ask you to be very brief, and I'm going to ask you to be disciplined in your answers as well. That's okay. Gentleman there.
Perish the thought.
Gentleman, that's like lift his glasses at the moment, and then we'll come to you, and then we'll come to his side.
Hello, my name's Luke. I just wanted to understand what you thought the controls we needed to have, given the speed that AI can bring changes in medicine and agriculture in particular through DNA sort of sequencing and sampling. How are you controlling for the first order impacts and then the second and tertiary order impacts thereafter?
I think you touched on two of the most pertinent areas for AI. Health, I'm a huge enthusiast for, as Syed knows, and that's, to me, all about the trust in the data that is absorbed into an AI system. But the use cases in the healthcare area are huge. And one of the good things we've got in healthcare is traditionally we have a much more a much greater understanding of the ethics of research. That's not true in a number of other areas of research, engineering, and so on and so forth. But in healthcare, I think that actually we've got quite a lot of the ingredients that we need in terms of making sure that we're developing the right systems, where we aren't quite, and side that have had this debate, and I think we're making great progress, is where personal patient data is involved, and we haven't created that aura of public trust. And when we do, then I think we'll be in a better space. In terms of agriculture, I think in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, I think it's got huge benefits. Now, you may say, oh, health is high risk. Well, of course it's high risk because it's, you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate data and so on and so forth. But, healthcare, we're very used to risk assessment in terms of research and development and so on. In agriculture, clearly we need risk assessment, but in many, many areas, I don't think it is so high risk. Of course, when you talk about food, there's a big risk element. But again, who would say that we should do away with all regulation as far as the quality of our foodstuffs is concerned? So I think you can go with a warp and the weft there, but I wouldn't suddenly start erecting great new structures there. And there is a debate between how far you have sectoral specific regulation as far as AI systems are concerned, and how, what in the horrible jargon, you need horizontally. I'm a believer in having light horizontal mandation of certain standards, but the standards might be sectoral.
We've got about 7 minutes. I just want to add to that. When I was health minister, some of the examples I saw from AI, being able to absorb large data sets of patient data and being able to actually identify or predict where people might suffer certain ailments. On top of that, the fact that we are now sampling genes of newborns, for example, is going to raise a number of issues. So, for example, what happens when you identify a bunch of people who might not develop an illness now, but they may well develop something when they're 40? When do you tell them ethically? Do you tell them at birth? Do you tell their parents at birth? Or do you wait until somewhere through their life? They say in their 20s or 30s, we've identified you as someone who's susceptible to this in your 40s. So there's a lot of ethics issues around having that much more information and that much more data. Just remind me, young man here and then the young man there.
Hi, I'm Andras, I'm a data scientist, but I wanted to ask you some questions about the online safety bill. You mentioned that some of the topics will be revisited because they were not implemented or just simply not well received.
Well, it hasn't come into effect yet. We're still ploughing through thousands of pages of Ofcom codes of conduct at the moment, but time will tell.
Sure. Just wanted to ask you, what do you think those topics will be that will be most revisited, and where do those discussions fit in your opinion?
Oh, I think it'll be exactly around the areas that we've been talking about, the deepfakery online, disinformation, misinformation. Can we get any closer to making them safer from things like child sexual exploitation as well? Have we got it right? Should we be putting more duties on social media, or should we be backing off a bit? I think every bit of legislation, we don't do enough post-led scrutiny. We just put this stuff into effect and we think, oh yeah, fine, but we don't see whether it's being an awful lot of criminal law, for instance, we hear all the time about laws not being enforced. We had a most bizarre debate this afternoon about bicycles. The Lords is very good on sort of things like badges and bicycles. And so we had this debate about whether or not the bicycle legislation was being enforced enough. But what we don't do is go back and look over the pages and pages of legislation that we put into effect. I'm hoping that won't be the case for the online safety legislation because it's so important.
And it's very important to have impact assessment, isn't it?
It is.
After legislation.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've written about in the past has been unintended consequences. Well-intentioned law made most people supported, but it had the opposite effect or made things worse. Do we have enough safeguards in our legal system that when something goes wrong, we can change the law quickly enough and reverse those problems? I think there were two more people. Can you remind me? The gentleman here with the hand up there, and then we'll have the young man at the back, and that may well be it.
Will Duffield, Cato Institute, have concerns about misinformation and impersonation already pushed private generative AI providers to be too restrictive in the side constraints they put on their tools? Most major systems won't create images of
public figures, even in caricature or art, even when they've been dead a long time, pen and ink didn't launch with such restrictions.
I think what we're going to have to do is build in a deep sense of irony into our AI systems, which isn't there. I mean, the problem is that it's all about the human emotions, and understanding parody and satire is something that a machine doesn't. And so how can we legislate for it without using a bit of a sledgehammer? And I agree with you, it's a bit of a problem. But nevertheless, the systems developers do need to have accountability in those circumstances. Not just the people who are creating the material, because otherwise, and especially the open source systems. So, we're bound to be a little bit crude about the way that it operates, but there is nothing stopping them at the moment. I mean, so there may be some other regulation, but to my knowledge, I mean, I've just been putting forward particular amendments to the, now I'm delighted to say, defunct data protection bill on exactly that, on deepfakes and producer liability. But so there is nothing actually at the moment that prevents that. There are in the Online Safety Act now prohibitions on sharing child sexual exploitation material, deepfakery, and so on. But that's the limit of it. So we haven't really gone very far, but if we did, it would be a bit crude, I think.
Young man in the back, and that will be it. You will hang around a little bit afterwards, won't you?
You bet.
To sell books, perhaps,
Oh, we'll be here to sign.
Sign and sell books.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't see. But
your name and...
So I'm Ryan. I work in audit, but I'm also, unfortunately, an anarcho-capitalist. My question to you is, generally you see these big tech companies, we mentioned monopolies, they advocate for more IP and more regulation. But do you think these AI tech companies are different in that nature? Do you think they will start advocating for a scaling back of IP because by nature of their product, they are recycling ideas?
That's a great question. I think there's an awful lot of fakery about the way that the big AI developers are presenting themselves. We had signing up to this great voluntary agreement at Bletchley Park. We had signing up to a new voluntary agreement in the South Korean summit. We had the grandstanding in the White House to a set of voluntary principles. I mean, how many voluntary principles are these splendid AI companies going to sign up to? And it's partly about trying to avoid regulation. But I think, it isn't good enough just to have the big companies sign up to a voluntary arrangement. It's a bit like, Google saying, we've got a set of voluntary standards for everything we do in search or whatever it may be. You have to have some sort of common regulation. Otherwise, the public isn't going to trust some of the other products that come out of the smaller companies, for instance. And I think it's a way of also excluding competition. So I do think that we need regulation, whatever kind of approach the big companies do take, and try and say, look, we don't really need this because we're signing up voluntarily. I don't know whether that makes me an anarcho-syndicalist, but anarcho-capitalist, and not anarcho-syndicalist. What's the difference between the two? I ask myself. Are they the two ends of the spectrum? Yeah, that's probably true.
You're supposed to answer questions, not ask questions. So thank you very much. You can sit down, by the way. Don't keep standing down. Thank you very much. Well, look, I think that's brought us neatly to 7:10. Can I start by thanking, before I thank Tim, can I start by thanking the IA donors that made this possible? Can I thank IA Book Club members? If you'd like to know more about the IA Book Club, please seek out Delena at the back. Delena, raise her arm, there arms. What we're going to do is we are going to, there'll be books for sale after this. Also, please help yourself to more refreshments till about 7:30, 7:40. Is that right? 8:30. Well, look, see, we've just liberalised our laws here instantly. You see, it just shows how easy it is. And also, maybe a couple of adverts. First of all, obviously, the advert for the book, available from all good booksellers, but also good booksellers in this very room at the back. Also, if you wish to donate to support the IA, on the back of the brochure there is a QR code. If you're interested in doing that, and I'm probably telling you about a few our next few events coming up. We try to be uncontroversial here. Our next event on the 20th of May is "Was Empire the Cause of Western Prosperity?" A nice, not uncontroversial subject. On Monday the 10th of June, we have by Michael F. Cannon, who wrote a book, "Recovery: How Markets Can Heal Healthcare," and so the author will be here. We have been accused of being too close to the Conservative Party. Yesterday, we had a guest speaker, Paul Reynolds, who was on the Liberal Democrat International Committee. Tonight, we've had a Lib Dem Lord. On the 11th of June, we have 4 Lib Dems, Sir Vince Cable, Lord Newby, Baroness Kramer, and Mark Oldham, who will be speaking about the Orange Book 20 years later, so the 20th anniversary of that. If you're interested in any of our events, please do sign up. We look forward to seeing you at them. Can I also just thank all of you for coming this evening? But more than anything, can we thank Lord Clement-Jones, Tim Clement-Jones, for being such a wonderful guest? And I do very much hope that you will buy many copies of his book. But give him you'll show your appreciation in the usual way.